Good afternoon and welcome to the Royal BC Museum and welcome to Live at Lunch, our free noon hour lecture series that features guests on the third Wednesday of every month. My name is Kim Goff and I'm a learning program developer here at the museum, and I'm honored to live and work here on the territory of the Lekwungen, known today as the Songhees and Shwepsum First Nation. Shwepsum is the original name of the Esquimalt, and it's the name they're preferring to use again, so we're trying to get that more regularly spoken. We acknowledge them as the original and ongoing stewards of the land and water, and of course their art and culture served as an inspiration for Emily Carr. The Royal BC Museum is home to the world's most extensive collection of materials by Emily Carr. And in addition to our online gallery, there is currently a small pocket gallery featuring some reproductions from our collection just down in the main lobby there. So if you haven't seen it yet, please check that out before you go today. Also nearby is Emily Carr House, a wonderful site to learn more about Emily's life and work. And we recently collaborated on an event with Carr House, which is where I met today's presenter. Kiera Bandy is an upper year undergraduate student at the University of Victoria, studying philosophy and gender studies. As a participant in the University of Victoria co-op program, Kiera spent a summer working at Carr House. Kiera is grateful to have the opportunity to explore some of the learning that resulted from her summer experience through today's Live at Lunch session. Please welcome Kiera.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Kim, for the introduction. I'd like to let you know I'm a bit of a nervous presenter. So if I make it through this whole thing without tears, please give me a big round of applause. I'm, quite nervous. And I'd like to start out by just giving some further context for my talk today. So as a student and as a person, I'm still very much not done with my learning process. And I had a period about 4 months to study Emily Carr, local history, and organizations that tell stories like hers. Over the course of my term, I was delighted to find that some of my most engaging moments were in conversation with my director and coworker, other people working in the same sector, and with members of the public stopping by. One thing that I do want to make clear as you settle into hearing my voice for the next little while is that I'm not an expert. Here we go. So you can see here a screenshot I've pulled from the Royal BC Museum with the description of these Live at Lunch talks. So I'm not the first part. I'm not a curator or an archivist, staff or researcher. I fall into that lovely second category, fascinating community members and guests. So I studied Emily Carr. My talk is going to be focused on my experience as a community member doing that role, my main takeaways, and as someone who's really enjoyed the learning process, and as virtue of being able to converse is part of conversations about topics like this in our community. There we go. So I'm also a settler of largely English, French, and German descent. My family first came here in the early 1910s with my great-grandfather on my father's side. This means that while my family hasn't been on this land quite as long as the Carr family, we have played an active role in creating the culture of the area. And we continue to play that role of a settler community that is contributing to the ongoing disruption of Lekwungen and Wasanich life. As I learned about Emily Carr as a cultural icon and about how Victoria has existed over time, a lot of dots started to connect for me about how it feels to be in the area. For example, I learned that as settlers began to encroach on Lekwungen and Wasanich territories, the settler town of Victoria swelled. There was this huge influx in the 1940s through the 1840s through the 1860s during the nearby gold rushes, and then settled into being a slower, culturally quite proper English, government-centered colony town when it was decided that the railroad would stop its tracks in Burrard's Inlet on the mainland instead of reaching all the way to this port. That was eye-opening in terms of articulating what many of us already feel. The local settler culture as being quite reserved at times, having strong English settler roots, and feeling a bit slower paced than the nearby town of Vancouver, right? Now, understanding this has not only helped situate myself as a settler on unceded Lekwungen and Wasanich territories, but it's helped me see what we need to take into account moving forward locally. The specific cultural, material, even spiritual tendencies of people in the area that impact our everyday relationships, things like our institutions' policies, and what might make effective methods for change. Now, I also know that this crowd is likely a majority settler crowd, and so I've written this talk with that in mind, making sure to allow that I know that many of us come to the land in very different ways. Often people come in ways that aren't straightforward, pleasant, or even choiceful. So the goals of my talk are to share the insights from my time at Carr House and contribute to this ongoing discussion and offer some perspectives about how to move forward. I'm going to end my talk with questions that came up while working at the heritage site that I think are important to reflect on, both as an individual and within the community more broadly. Now, the structure of my talk, just so you have a sense of where we're going, is actually going to sort of mirror my own experience at Carr House. So I'll get an introduction to Emily Carr, although I know many of you might probably already know a bit about who she is. We'll learn about the house a little bit, learning about Emily Carr from the perspective working in that house. And then 1/4 of my way through, so a month and a half into my short term, encountering an article called Looking for Lucy Homiscanus, Confronting Emily Carr, that really contributed to how I made sense of everything at that job. So, some historical context. For those of us who might not know, Emily Carr is considered a Canadian icon, best known for her art featuring modern West Coast landscapes. She also wrote several books depicting Victoria in her childhood, her interactions with Indigenous people all the way up the coast, and her trips studying abroad, amongst other topics. Many people in Canada do know about her cranky but overly sincere personality, her spiritual understanding of the land, and her relationship to the world of modern art, specifically to the Group of Seven, a group of settler men often identified as the fathers of modern art in Canada. They labeled her as the mother. Now, this is the story of Emily Carr that you're going to get as a blurb at an art gallery, right? Or on a calendar, or from a quick Google search. It's also the story that many Canadians grew up with and learned to identify with when recognizing themselves and her as Canadian. So I have some examples of her art here. These are my favorites, actually. They also happen to be public domain, so I was comfortable taking them. So you can see above the gravel pit, that's Up Island. Odds and Ends features clear cutting. She painted environmental concerns often. She saw the landscape changing rapidly, and Vanquished. So she often wanted to capture the disappearing Indigenous life, often recognized as a stereotype, the disappearing Indian. Now, beyond the art gallery blurb is a much longer story. Much like the story of any one of us in this room, it would take a lifetime to tell, which I'm going to shorten that by a lot, just because I know you have things to do. Now, in order to situate Emily Carr more fully, it helps to understand the world she was born into. Now, I believe I have some examples of her writing here first. There we go. So those are the two books she's most famous for. Growing Pains is her autobiography, and the Book of Small is specifically her childhood, And it's important to note also that her stories are not necessarily strictly factual. She wrote in one of her books that she was 15 heading up the coast on her own. She was 27. So an important part of understanding her words, right? And here's a bit about her cultural impact. So she did form an identity for settlers on the West Coast. This is a catalog that she drew for an exhibition that she got into in 1927. Now, for her childhood, Carr House, if you've ever been, it's just down the street. And it's very close to an original local village site, Megan Hill, which stood where Beacon Hill Park is today. The Lekwungen-speaking people in the village would have done reef net fishing, collected clams from the nearby mudflats, and used camas flower bulbs, or kwelal, for a large part of their diet, and continue to do so as much as is still possible today. The village lasted until the 1840s, and that's when the Hudson's Bay Company purchased the land from the village, and the indigenous people were pushed out into the inner harbor. To give us a sense of how the area has changed from where we are now, the mudflats, where the Lekwungen-speaking people cultivated those clam beds, those lie under the Empress Hotel. And that's a change that Emily Carr saw herself in her childhood and wrote about. Similar changes would be a sawmill being built in Esquimalt, polluting the water and shifting it from being a very highly desired area to a not very desired area. Now, the relationship to the land as Emily Carr's family arrived was moving from one of interconnectedness to one of taming, something that Emily Carr wrote explicitly about seeing in these settlers who, especially the ones who had lived in England first, were building their new lives here in her childhood. The area was developed into farmland by the Hudson's Bay Company, and in 1863, an upper middle class English merchant named Richard Carr purchased 4 acres of the land and built his house so that him and his wife could raise their children there. Little did he know, but one of his many children would go on to become a prominent Canadian author and artist, Emily Carr. Now, Richard Carr had made a fortune supplying the gold rush in San Francisco and tried a similar technique when he moved here, opening up a dry goods and general store on Wharf Street. This family money provided Emily Carr the access to things like a safe childhood, education, play, and status, and eventually would fund her entry to art school. Now, people often know her as a struggling artist. That's because, unlike our love of art, money runs out. And her writing and art was never popular enough during her lifetime to provide financial security for her. She was deeply unpopular in the settler community for her non-traditional opinions and her non-traditional creations. Now, Emily Carr's childhood had important figures that remind people coming into Carr House Historic Site that while she struggled as an artist, her life was enabled by privilege. And this can be quite shocking to people coming in to visit. And it was shocking to me as well, coming to learn. So we know from Emily's writings and the 1881 census record that the Carr family hired a young Chinese man named Chong. Now, he worked as a cook for them. The is a Cantonese form of familiarity, so because that's what it has on the census record, we don't even know his full real name. Emily writes about him being a child when he's brought into the house, about the age of 12. We can't quite trust her writing ages, but it was quite common to have Chinese boys at the time as servants in a household like this one. And they nicknamed him, the family nicknamed him Bong, probably because of the gong they would have rung for him to come and bring the next part of the meal. This would have been fairly common practice in Victoria for a couple of reasons. Victoria had North America's largest Chinatown at the time. A lot of young Chinese men's labor was exploited in the building of the railroad and in the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. These men often would have known how to cook and clean up because while the settler men had that done for them while they were working, the Chinese men had to do that for themselves. And they were facing stereotypes about being more expendable or subservient. There is still a vibrant Chinese community here and a beautiful Chinese Canadian museum where you can learn about figures in the community, hardships and accomplishments, and the local arts and culture that have existed over time. I really recommend taking a visit there if you had the chance. Now, the other worker that the Carr family hired was an Indigenous laundry woman named Mary. Mary had converted to Roman Catholicism and moved off the Songhees Reserve into the Fairfield area. She would have worn Western-styled clothing and spoken English around the Carr family. We don't have a photograph of her, and often in the Carr House we show a photograph of Indigenous women wearing similar clothing up in Alert Bay, with long braids, just like the ones that Mary's described as wearing. For people coming to Carr House, it's often uncomfortable to hear this part of Emily Carr's story, and it's uncomfortable to tell as well. These people's lives were just as full, vibrant, and important as Emily Carr's, and yet not only was their work in service of Emily Carr's family, but rather than fulfilling a dream like becoming an artist, but we struggle to find information about them now, because that's not the part of the story that people tried to preserve at the time, that families like the Carr family tried to preserve at the time. So we struggle to look beyond the words of Emily Carr herself. As part of a team of 2 or 3 people at Carr House, and being a co-op student for just 4 months, you're left with whole worlds that you hope to find out more about, and you feel the weight of these people's stories as people are coming into the house quite excited to learn about Emily Carr. Now, one thing we can ask when encountering this disconnect is, why are people so excited to learn about Emily Carr in the first place? And this is something that I started to think about as my tours started, and I encountered people feeling very similar things every day. When she got into this exhibition in 1927 in Toronto and met the group of 7, she felt like she was finally coming home, finding people who were incorporating new European art styles and Indigenous teachings into modern European art. Her art fell into the vision of the white male curators of this specific exhibit about how Canada would define itself as a modern nation, having progressive, down-to-earth values, right? With Indigenous people and their cultures as unique features of Canada, rather than as sovereign nations that were systematically oppressed by Canada. Her stories were the first works with her own community that her own community liked. They were played over the radio in 1943, I think, because they portrayed an early Victoria and its characters with care from a relatable perspective. She herself saw Indigenous people struggling, and part of her project was painting totem poles, Indigenous symbols, and people, because she wanted to document them before they were gone, a narrative that became sympathetic to Canadians and Americans in the early 20th century, often called the salvage paradigm. Now, as I mentioned, the group of 7 labeled her the mother of modern art in Canada, and she called herself the Western spoke of their wheel. Most of them were in the East. Now, she was and still is recognized as part of a movement of forming Canadian identity through art. Emily Carr wasn't liked for this project at the time, but it's important to note that if an Indigenous person had painted what she'd painted at the time, they could have been put in jail or fined because of the potlatch bans in place at the time. As Emily was trying to capture Indigenous life, Indigenous women were erased from cultural narratives, removed from positions of power. Indigenous people were denied the right to legal routes for land claims, and subjected to colonial violence that continues to this day. Emily Carr did see a bit of this and tried her hardest to change it from her position as an artist, without a lot of inside knowledge about those cultures or nations, right? She's often celebrated for preserving Indigenous heritage and art, but it's partly because Indigenous people literally weren't allowed to do that for themselves at the time. And now I've gotten a bit ahead of myself in the slides. Here you go. Here are some quotes that sort of get different parts of her cultural impact on people. I'll read them out loud because I know it's a lot of reading to do. The men resent a woman getting any honor in what they consider is essentially their field. Men painters mostly despise women painters. So I've decided to stop squirming, to throw any honor in with Canada and women. Then it's wonderful to feel the grandness of Canada in the raw, not because she is Canada, but because she's something sublime that you were born into, some great rugged power that you're a part of. Indian art broadened my seeing, loosened the formal tightness I had learned in England's schools. Its bigness and stark reality baffled my white man's understanding. I had been schooled to see outsides only, not struggle to pierce. So here we can see a couple different pieces that is how she would have understood her cultural impact at the time, and how we're able to see it now. So now that I provided some background about Emily Carr, I'll talk about Carr House, the historic site itself. Have any of you actually been there before? Okay, lovely. So you will have seen it before then, and you'll know a bit about what it's about. So it is a provincial and national historic site. The house has been restored to how it was in the 1860s when Richard Carr and his wife Emily Carr Sr. moved in. It exists as a historic site, center for artists and art-based education, and as a small collection of artifacts. And by this point, you might have noticed that I'm not focusing so much on the landscapes of Emily Carr themselves, but on the role that Emily Carr, her art, and her stories play in our culture. This actually reflects the role of Carr House Historic Site itself. It doesn't have her art on display. We could not keep it safe, never mind the wide range of temperatures experienced in a heritage house built in 1863. But instead, what Carr House is able to do for a lot of people coming here is to make Emily Carr's story more full, complicated, and placed in the context of many other stories, like Chong's and Mary's. Many people coming to a historic site like Carr House are already in love with the character of Emily Carr, and that's just what it is. It's a character. When you come to Carr House, you learn a much more full perspective about who she was as a person and who how she would have existed in a world just like ours, but a little newer. When you step into her world, it can be pretty uncomfortable to recognize that not only was she not a perfect person, but that fundamentally her status as an icon is enabled by the fact that she was a white, privileged settler. So complicating that art gallery blurb that I gave you is a daily process at Carr House and is a large part of what happens there. Entering her world, people realize that her idyllic childhood spent in the safety of her family garden and running off into what felt like untouched wilderness to her, the one that she cites as a foundation to her art and stories, was founded on settler occupation of the land that was already governed, lived on, and cared for, at the cost of childhoods like Chong or like the many Indigenous children who would have been in Megan Hill. Many of these issues came up in long conversations with my coworker and director, and with visitors. When I emailed one of my professors at UVic and let her know what my role was for the summer, she sent me along an article by Indigenous scholar Sarah Hunt titled "Looking for Lucy Hamaskanis, Confronting Emily Carr." And I don't know how to pronounce Lucy's last name. I've never actually heard it said out loud, so I'm giving it my best shot. Reading it and reading that article became one of the most impactful moments in my role and directed most of my actions and thoughts afterwards. And I'm just going to show a couple of pictures of the historic site. I keep forgetting there's slides. There we go. And this, I think you probably recognize this building. So I headed into the archives and got to listen to a tape from one of Emily Carr's friends, a very intimate experience listening to a cassette tape with someone's voice on it from a while ago. So here's the article. So Sarah Hunt, who also actually has an Indigenous name that I don't know how to pronounce, is a scholar of mixed settler, Kwakwakwa, and Tlingit ancestry. She's a Canada Research Chair at UVic in Indigenous Political Ecology in the School of Environmental Studies. The article that she wrote was first done as a talk at Legacy Art Gallery and was spoken and written with an audience of Indigenous women and gender diverse people in mind. She does write that if any settlers find her article and her restorying of the coast helpful, then that's good too. So that's what I experienced this summer. So she wrote this article not in the style of an argument. There's no premises and conclusion about what we should do or what's going on, but rather as a personal narrative like it was in her speech, tracking her exploration of her ancestry, and specifically her great-great-grandmother, Lucy Homascanis, and her great-great-grandfather, George Hunt, and her encounters with Emily Carr as a hyper-visible Canadian icon whose stories are often uplifted at the cost of telling stories like Lucy's. Now, Lucy, Sarah Hunt's great-great-grandmother, was of Tlingit and Kwakwakwa descent. She would have held a lot of power over their land in governance, decision-making, and managing the ethical responsibilities to the land, as well as relationships with other nations. And her grandfather was George Hunt, a man of Tlingit and English ancestry, who had a long-standing professional relationship with Franz Boas, often considered the founder of Northwest anthropology, the Northwest Coast anthropology. In order to recognize Lucy Homascanis' role, to give us a better understanding of who she would have been, I'm going to quote Sarah Hunt. So, as a high-ranking, politically important woman, Lucy had access to specific social, cultural, political, legal, and linguistic knowledge. And just like their cultural symbols, these were not to be shared with anyone, but were carefully governed. That's on page 13. A lot of knowledge and those decision-making processes would have been held tightly within nations and families, and were an important part of maintaining governance over their own cultural systems. And later on that same page, women like my great-great-grandmother continue to be pushed out of their place of governance over these cultural landscapes and over the places today that are the very sites of settler scholarship, ecotourism, and identification with nature. So Sarah Hunt's story is one of recognizing the role of her grandmother and struggling to find information about her, just like we struggle to find information about Mary or Ah Chong. As she's searching through anthropological texts that systematically ignore roles that women would have had in potlatches, in the making of cedar canoes, she's finding that everywhere she goes, there's a lot about Emily Carr. And so this isn't a straightforward argument about the connection between Emily Carr and Lucy. Lucy would have been an adult at the time where Emily Carr was growing up, but more just about how our culture highlights certain stories and denies others, and the power and access that Emily Carr would have had while others were being denied that same power. The paper itself, I'd recommend reading on your own time. It involves partly grieving the information that she can't find about her great-great-grandmother, and it's something that I can't and don't really want to communicate in a crowd, but I do think it's worth looking at on your own time. Now, in terms of making the connection, she cites and she pulls together various sources highlighting Emily Carr as a gendered symbol of settler identity and safety. When we look at those open landscapes of Emily Carr, we feel awe at nature, but there's no recognition of the roles that Indigenous people have had in maintaining that nature. And one thing that we really don't see is her paintings of Indigenous people or her pottery featuring Indigenous symbols. Those artifacts and pieces are much harder to give a short art gallery blurb to, right? They're harder to enter into and understand in their full cultural context. But what it means is that what we see is a lot of things without any recognition of Indigenous livelihood and landscapes. So what Sarah Hunt recommends for today is a few different things towards the end of the article. She recognizes that our resources are not very evenly distributed and recommends that we really take seriously engaging with resource allocation and giving voice and power to Indigenous women and gender diverse people. Highlighting the sort of way that we talk about figures like Emily Carr, the way that we feel awe with her art, the way that we feel admiration about her as a strong settler woman who stood up when people really didn't like what she was doing. And she says that the only way to answer some of these questions is to hear from Indigenous women and gender diverse relatives themselves. So not me, but I'm here today to pass it on, I suppose. And so putting the pieces together towards the end of my time at Carr House meant recognizing in my own role the human connection in learning processes that I saw every day. A lot of people were quite open to learning about these things and were quite active conversation partners about things that are actually really difficult to manage feeling. The feeling of discomfort is necessary, but yeah, exactly what it is, uncomfortable. And there are very beautiful parts of Emily Carr's story and the Carr House National Historic Site as well. And I'd like to highlight specifically that there are very local things we can do. So we're on Lekwungen and Lekwungen territory here, and I'm also on Wasanich territory, where my home is. And what we need to do here, from my understanding, is paying attention to local nations. Almost all of them actually have really easy, accessible websites at this point, and that's a good place to start, I think. They often have resources for settlers. And then I wanted to highlight one thing that I actually just learned about, which is the Land Trust Society. Various nations now have access to actually getting their land back, which is a really big step and really neat. There are a couple things you can do to support organizations like that one. You can donate land, write it into your will, or donate money directly. And as I head into the final pieces of my talk, I'd like to close my talk by stating the main 3 questions that came up for me during my summer spent researching Emily Carr at Carr House National Historic Site. These are the things that I kind of really took away as the role of cultural spaces, where we place our resources. What does it mean to be working in a place like Carr House and having conversations with people that you're working with and with the public about these difficult questions? They're ongoing, and I don't think that they have very easy solutions. Asking how we tell stories. It's a huge part of Carr House, our lack of art and the fact that we have a lot of artifacts and a space that you can fully immerse yourself in a historical world is a huge entry point for many people. And I think that 2 virtues that I really noticed in almost everyone I spoke to were reflexivity and adaptability. These are talked a lot about in my, they're talked about a lot in my classes. Your ability to take new information and learn and grow. I think that's something that we all aim to cultivate, and I think many people do a very good job of it. And to conclude with these final 3 questions. So how do we tell stories to each other and with each other? What we've been exploring today is how we've been telling Emily Carr's story and how we might tell others as well, or even instead of at times. What does it mean for us to have history and entertainment in the same space? People come looking for a very good time, and sometimes it's a pretty surprising encounter. But you hope that part of the task is that learning more and feeling the full range of things that come along with someone's history is still a very enriching and important experience, and is part of why people go to spaces like Carr House, is to experience those things. And then how do our individual ways of coming to this land affect our responsibilities moving forward? Here I'm thinking about my own family's route to the land. I would pause to reflect on your own entry to the land. I think that understanding that my family has been here for a while makes me recognize the way that my great-grandfather, my grandmother, my father, and now me all have had an impact in what conversations happen, what ethical discussions are being had, and what material things are happening in our community. I've been part of it for a while, and I think you're kind of left with this question, or I'm left with the question after thinking about these things is, okay, I was born here, what do I do now? And I think that's something that I will be thinking about for a long time. And finally, what is the role between identity and story, identity and art? That's actually meant to say identity, story, and art. That's my bad. I guess it doesn't make too much of a change. So when's the last time that you saw a story or read a story or saw art and felt it reach deep inside of you and tug on something? It might have been even just in the news this morning. It might have been in a conversation you had over breakfast or a movie you watched last night. How did it stay with you? How did those emotions stay with you? What facts did you learn? What emotions did you learn? Whose role in the story did you place yourself in? I'm thinking here actually of a specific instance at Carr House that my coworker witnessed this summer. A couple of young boys came in and identified most strongly with Ah Chong's story, not Emily Carr's. The majority of people who come in identify with Emily Carr, but I think it's important that we think about all the different entry points to stories like this one.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, I'll be done in a minute actually, and then yeah, 100%, yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
No worries. And so yeah, does seeing Emily Carr's art and her landscapes make you feel connected to the earth? Does it make you think about environmental issues? Does it make you think about the indigenous history on the land? How might it think to feel about indigenous women and gender diverse relatives having long-standing relationships to that same land that's painted there? And historic sites are often places where history comes to life for people through these personal narratives, providing a space for connections to be made between past, present, and future. People often feel drawn to Emily Carr's story because she's someone who tried to live up to her own values to the very best of an ability in a culture where she wasn't really recognized or liked for that. She's accessible to people and represents for a lot of people a deep internal strength and creativity. And I think that's important as we think about her as a symbol that we can identify with. This is my last slide, so thank you so much. I was able to get the position at UVic partly because of the team at Carr House and because of all the support that I receive at UVic, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much to Pascal, Shannon, and Megan at Carr House. I greatly appreciated the conversations that we had, the incredible amount of support that I experienced there and continue to experience after my role. Thank you, Shannon. And the work that all three of you put in to make Carr House a place that is exciting, educational, and full of care for the space, the history, and for the human connections that I know happen there every day. And finally, thank you to Kim for the opportunity to do this talk. Not everyone gets a chance to reflect on their learning in this way, and I'm very grateful to be one of the fascinating community members who was able to do this. So thank you so much.